Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help.
Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who have experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about surviving the holidays. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have Suzanne Higbie-Long. Suzanne uses she, her pronouns and is a counselor intern at Victim Service Center. She earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Central Florida and will graduate from Rollins College with her master's in mental health counseling this May. Suzanne feels that, along with individual therapy, support groups, and group therapy are important pieces in a survivor's journey. Suzanne is a strong advocate for trauma survivors and believes we need a call to action against rape culture and sexual assault in our society. So Suzanne, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be with you both today.
Absolutely. And I have returning probably for the millionth time, Kevin Fox. Kevin uses he, him pronouns and is a registered mental health counselor intern with the state of Florida. Kevin worked as a high school teacher while receiving his Master's of Arts in clinical mental health counseling from Rollins College. He has worked with adolescents with substance use issues, Equality Florida for LGBTQ plus rights, and in the UF Health Center Cancer Center at Orlando Health, counseling and performing therapy with cancer patients and their families. His passion when working with clients is to help them increase their resilience and satisfaction with their everyday lives. He seeks to help clients increase their meaning from life and live more authentically and honestly. Kevin, thank you for being here. Once again, it's always a pleasure to have you back on.
Yes, and I always love being on the podcast, so you can ask me to be on as many as you want.
Thank goodness.
As long as the viewership doesn't go down.
No. It's always a pleasure. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with both of you. As a really brief introduction, as many of you know, the VSC offers free confidential therapy to survivors of trauma, but under that therapy umbrella, the VSC hosts group workshops aimed to teach skills to clients that they can use throughout their daily lives. One such workshop is Surviving the Holidays, a group for clients who do not feel safe around their family. So I'd like to start off this episode with a brief overview of this workshop. What does it entail and the purpose of it? So could you speak a little bit about Surviving the Holidays?
Yeah, it's a group. So I guess I'll jump in first because I did this also last year before COVID times when we could be in person. So it took a little bit of a different form, but it's an annual group we do sometime around November, early December, to help speak with clients that just have some kind of trouble, anxiety, concern about seeing potentially difficult family members around the holidays, whether it's because of their specific victimization, whether they have to see their abuser over the holidays, whether it's an issue with boundaries, whether it's just a hard family in general. I think we can all relate to a degree. Having that family member, that friend that just won't stop asking personal questions or getting in our space or bringing up politics at every turn or looking for that kind of fight. And so this kind of tries to touch on all of that, whether it's as severe as like I have to be with my abuser on the holidays and put on a good face, to my family is this political view and I'm this political view, and just being there can be hard. Wherever it is on that spectrum, that's kind of what we like to address.
That all sounds so important. Suzanne, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, that's a great overview, Kevin. And I guess just, you can't control what your family does, but you can control how you respond to them. And the workshop just does a great job of giving people tools and strategies to just navigate, family situations and the holidays. Holidays are already stressful, but family can increase it.
Yeah, that was actually that leads to my next question. Why do you think the holidays are a stressful time? And why are they stressful for survivors of trauma in particular?
That's a hard question because there's so many answers. People who, I guess in my experience speaking with some clients and some survivors, holidays are supposed to be a feel-good time of family and togetherness. And especially for those who may have suffered childhood trauma, holidays may have become tainted as a result, because that's when that family member that was an abuser was there and could take advantage of a situation. Or that's when my family who didn't believe me pretends that everything is fine, and there's a huge void there where it's like the most traumatizing thing that's happened, I don't have your support for. Those two are the ones that stand out the most, on top of the like, oh, or my family bickers, or my family again has those frustrating political talks. I think sometimes at the core it's when sexual abuse and family intersect, then this quote unquote family together happy fun time of the holidays comes up. It's a reminder, it's a re-traumatization.
Yeah, and holidays are stressful in general. We may be worried about finances, spending too much money, worried about attending social events. And this year with COVID, not attending social events and being disconnected, and just the added hustle and bustle in a culture where our homes are supposed to look like a Pinterest model home. And then it's all good stress, but it's stress nonetheless. So I think everybody's in this heightened activated state going into the holidays.
That's a really good point, bringing up COVID, Suzanne. Do you think that there's some, decision making for people? Do you think that there's some pressure from some families to, come on, it's Christmas, come over, or come on, it's whatever holiday that they celebrate? Do you think that that's probably happening this year?
Absolutely. Feeling bad that you can't be with the ones you love. And just the overall disconnection that we've all experienced in the last year. And, in a time when we all have more time in the holiday season to reflect going into the new year. And, 2020's been a crazy ride. And we just have more time to just sit and think about either what we have, what we don't have, and family dynamics. So, and I think holidays can be especially stressful for trauma victims as well, as we've been saying.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of delve in a little bit more of what you were talking about, Kevin, about the re-traumatization and re-victimization that can happen if the trauma is related to the family. Why might someone not feel safe around their family? Any other examples you'd like to bring up, or anything you'd like to dive into?
Yeah, I don't know why, and this is the stereotyped like bad family member, but let's, for a hypothetical example, say it's like that uncle. I don't know why it always seems to be. Sorry if you're an uncle listening. There's more great uncles than there are bad ones, but for every reason, I always think of like the uncle that is invading the personal space there. And so if that's your dad's brother, you might never have told, because how am I going to ruin their relationship? So then it's kind of that silent suffering. If the abuse persists to this day, is it going to happen this time? Like, is this going to be another time where I have to ignore what's happening because of the holidays. And even if the abuse is past, if that person's still there, you know that memory is there, and then those triggers manifest, whether it's when that person who's the abuser just goes to give a friendly hug, and it's that moment of panic of, even though I'm in a crowded room and everyone's watching and we're all getting together as family, like that feeling, that crossing of that physical boundary brings up all those years of trauma, whether intentional or not. And so I think of that, it's a lot of that walking on eggshells feelings, like you're waiting for that foot to drop potentially if you're encountering the abuser again. But I think more people too have that burden of the silent suffering, where because they didn't want to be the ones to ruin a family dynamic, they might be sitting there with this heavy burden that they can't rely on anyone else to help support them because the fear is so great. What if I ruin the family? What if they don't believe me? What if they don't believe me and they kick me out, for trying to ruffle feathers? There's so many layers to what's going on, especially, talking about sexual assault is so modern in a sense. Like it's something that is much more commonplace now, but even bringing it up to parents or grandparents of a different generation the idea of believing the survivor doesn't necessarily exist in that generational way that it might now with millennials and Gen Z.
That's a really good point too. I hadn't thought of that, thinking of talking about sexual assault as that's a newer thing that people are actually speaking up, which is fantastic. But it makes sense that that generational gap could exist, and why that, on top of everything else that you were saying, why someone might not feel safe. Suzanne, did you have anything you wanted to jump in on?
Yeah, I totally agree with Kevin, and I totally can see the generation gap. The older generation has that pick yourself up by your bootstrap mentality. Don't feel the emotions, just keep moving forward. And what's great about the newer generations, the younger generations, is they're taking the time to pause and reflect. And, memories from abusive or neglective environments are unhappy memories and can trigger that fight, flight, or freeze survival mode. And then, stress around the holidays is already high. And now you've got distress from the survival mode that's activated. So, the brain and body doesn't know the difference. So it reacts as if they're both in survival situations. And I just think it's the younger generations are in a great place to do things differently in a healthier way.
When we were planning this podcast, one of the terms that came up was emotional toxicity. So I was hoping that either of you or both of you could actually talk a little bit about this and what it means.
Yeah, so emotional toxicity occurs in places where fear, insecurity, and helplessness is running rampant within someone or the situation. Think of someone in your life who may try to control those around them or manipulate people. They might judge or make people feel shameful. They could be overly sarcastic. They could be overly negative. Maybe they can't be happy with other people's successes, or maybe they take delight in tearing someone else's dreams and values down. And if you're listening to this list and you can pinpoint someone, chances are that person might be operating out of that emotional toxicity, and that relationship becomes strained, especially as you work on trauma and you work on creating healthier habits for yourself.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's and I think, yeah, sometimes it can be very unintentional. So in that example of someone who's been traumatized and they're around their family might just be doing their normal thing without realizing that it's creating an emotionally toxic environment. If someone, sexual assault can and very oftentimes leads to lower self-esteem sometimes, kind of as part of that healing process and one of those after effects. And if you have that mom or that aunt that's always nitpicking, like, that sweater doesn't fit you quite right. Did you stop going to the gym? I know you're in grad school. You used to be so thin. You've put on some weight. Or those little gnats that are flying around your head are just, to the person saying it, they might not have any idea that the weight that's behind that. But for a survivor who certain words are triggers, especially if they were in an unhealthy relationship where that's how their abuser emotionally controlled them. And again, maybe that aunt, that mom is coming from a good place, but it's that constant, like, everywhere I'm going, I have that, hair standing on the back of my neck kind of feeling, can be emotionally toxic.
That's a really good point that I didn't even think about, that these could be stirring up emotions and memories of how their abuser did put downs and manipulated them in the past. That makes a lot of sense. We were bringing up boundaries, and we've talked a lot about boundaries on this podcast, but I don't think we ever actually defined what a boundary is. So I'd like to ask both of you, what is a boundary? How would you define a boundary?
I think when I think of boundaries, it's any, not necessarily physical barrier, but some kind of barrier between me and the people around me that is set up to take care of both parties, really. They're not made to be one-sided, although I think we can talk about them in that way. If I have a great rapport and relationship with a couple family members, but their political views could not be more different than mine, a boundary could be like, let's not talk about this because we love each other and we care about each other. And if we talk about this, we're just going to fight. So like our boundary for the holidays when we see each other is let's not talk about what's been going on politically. And that can be that healthy boundary. Even with physical boundaries, people who aren't comfortable with the hug, or at least would like to be asked first, like, oh, can I give you a hug? Some people might take offense, like, oh, you don't want me hugging you. And if I just want you to ask first, and if you do, then there's no animosity between us because I see you're respecting me and I'm still inviting that from you. I just would like the courtesy of a heads up, maybe because of what I've been through or because of how my trauma is affecting me. So really they're set up to protect both parties. I think setting them up can be hard sometimes because sometimes people will feel offended, like, oh, well, you don't want me to hug you, or you don't want me to talk about this. Like, why do you not think I care about you? Do you not think I love you? And it can be hard. I'd say boundaries is a constant. Even when you set it up, you have to set it up again and then again and again most of the time. But it's just that barrier, like, hey, here's a line for me. It doesn't mean I love you any less. But this is what is going to make me feel comfortable and safe at this time.
I love that. When I talk about boundaries too, I love that you brought up that it's to keep both people safe. I like to think of boundaries too of this is how to love me. I'm teaching you how to respect and love me. So absolutely. Suzanne, is there anything you wanted to jump in on with boundaries?
Yeah, I think Kevin had a lot of great examples. I look at it as a sphere of protection, to communicate to others our needs and our desires and the ways that we wish to be treated. It's important in teaching people how to honor us and our experience. Boundaries teach others how we want to be treated in order to feel emotionally safe, and they limit emotional toxicity. So we talked about that in the previous question. And like with Kevin's example, if you put up a boundary and then the response is, oh, why are you so fill in the blank? That would be an example of someone trying to push through the boundary and an example of emotional toxicity.
That's such a good point to bring up, Suzanne. So I wanted to ask, how do you teach the skill of setting boundaries in surviving the holidays?
Really through a lot of different ways, because there are different different people are requesting different boundaries. At the end of the day, I think the easiest way to express the boundary is that it's personal. And if you think of those times that you feel uncomfortable or you feel activated or you feel stressed having certain conversations, certain interactions with people, then that's your body telling you this is where I need to put up a boundary. And for some people, it looks so different, depending on their family and their lifestyle and their family's walk of life and the family culture. But I think your body's telling you when you need the boundary. It sends that shiver up your spine. It sends that feeling in your gut, like this isn't my thing, or this isn't how I want to interact with this person. So let's redefine that interaction with the boundary. And we use, and I know we'll get to it in a little bit, but we use, a client bill of rights that kind of has a list of things that it's okay to set a boundary for without having to feel guilty.
I love that. Yeah, while you were talking, I was thinking about how it does take some kind of self-reflection of, where are my boundaries? And, Suzanne, I really want to hear from you too on this too. But my question is kind of like, where do you think a person should start? I think, do you ever speak with, survivors that are like, oh, that's a boundary I can set? I had no idea, those kinds of things. Any kind of comments on that?
Yes. I think the first step is to become aware when we need to set a boundary, what line is being crossed. I believe that our body tells us when we need to set boundaries. And the difficult part about trauma survivors is oftentimes they're so out of tune with their body that they don't know when to activate, and set that boundary for themselves. I think the second step is to identify how we want to respond when someone has crossed the boundary. Many times we are blindsided with a comment or feeling, and our brains kick into survival mode. There is a technique called flagging the minefield. This is when a person can, with a therapist or a friend that they trust, just list and think of possible blasts of toxicity in their families and flag those scenarios and prepare and plan how you would respond to those scenarios. This strategy is pretty empowering because you're looking into the future and you can just navigate what, you're just becoming aware and you're just accepting people for how they're going to be, but you're creating a more empowered response to them. And in turn, you survive that emotional blast.
I love that. I love that idea of the word empowerment. Yeah, as you bring that up, of course, it's such an important word, especially with survivors of trauma. This idea of it's almost like you're giving them a toolkit. You can't, like you said in the beginning, Suzanne, you can't control people, you can't control your family, you can't control how they're going to react to how you set a boundary and those things. But you can have, you can be ready for it. I love that idea of flagging the minefield. That makes a lot of sense. It would make me feel a lot more prepared for interactions with people, for sure. Kevin, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say as another like practical example, because I guess in my mind I'm like, oh yeah, we should give more practical takeaways too, is scaling. I always talk about scaling when it comes to triggers. Like, what is my 1 to 3? The small little things that are, okay, I can manage this, I don't need to do much, versus my 8 to 10 out of 10 triggers. Like, if this happens, what do I know I need to do? Whether I can, because some triggers we learn, like, I know that this is going to set me off at about a 6, and here's what I know I can do that'll help. But there's always, you don't know something's a trigger until you find out because you're triggered. So sometimes I think in conjunction with flagging the minefield, like, if I hit a 10 out of 10 and I've never experienced that specific one before, what do I at least know works with my other 10 out of 10s? Or, with the environment that I'm in, if I'm up at my parents' house in a different state or whatever, like, where can I plan to go or what can I plan to do to manage that? But I think and I encourage all clients, like, journal. Make it draw like a big line in a scale. What's your 1 out of 1s, your 1 out of 10, you're 5 out of 10, you're 10 out of 10. And then, of course, with time, the goal is to reduce. If this was a 10 out of 10, how can we get that to an 8? How can we manage that better? And so I think those two together can be like the best weapons, so to speak, going into like a stressful situation. Because it gives a solid plan to anyone of like, here's what I know I can do. Here's what I know I need to watch out for.
I love that. And I think it comes with that self-reflection too of, where are, I love that idea that it's not just like you're either triggered or you're not. There is, there are triggers that are more affecting a person than others. So it's really, I love that idea. When I teach about setting boundaries in my trainings, I always like to mention that as we communicate our needs, feelings of guilt or embarrassment may come up. This is just a societal thing. I think we could do a whole podcast of why that is. But with that being said, how do you teach your clients to process these emotions while they set these boundaries?
Yeah, I use the phrase, give my clients grace and the space to work through things. I compare it to a coach and their players. When a coach is running practice, most likely she's not going to have her players run drills for skills that they've mastered. They're going to run drills for skills that they need to improve in and get better at. And, a therapy session, my clients are learning the skill of setting boundaries and identifying sensations in their body and becoming aware of triggers. So my goal is to give them the grace and space to do that. And to do the work on the boundary skill. And hopefully the feelings of guilt and embarrassment means that they are activating their growth mindset, and that it is uncomfortable, but it means it's working, and it means that they are taking self-care and working towards mental health and peace of mind and serenity.
Beautifully put. Kevin, are there any tips that you give to your clients?
Yes. I guess in my head, I always try to tailor to the individual, but I think the greatest gift is like talking about mindfulness and awareness. If I can practice being more aware of myself and my responses, aware of my emotional reactions. Like if I have a weird feeling in my gut, what is that telling me? Is that telling me that I'm anxious about something? Is it telling me I'm depressed about something? Like what are these kind of feelings, these body sensations we can be aware of that are trying to tell us like, hey, we're starting to enter treacherous waters. So kind of increasing that level of awareness, especially, in these holiday seasons where stuff can be flying at us left and right, especially with COVID. Like it's so, not to date this podcast for future listeners, but just increasing that sense of mindfulness. Like I know where I am. I know what my sadness is telling me. I know what my anger is telling me. I know what my frustration is telling me. And I'm building my plan to manage that.
I love that you both kind of talked about how, a lot of times I think try to maybe not ignore, but kind of maybe move on from a feeling. But it feels like you're almost saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of lean into it and process it. And I think that takes a lot of courage.
Absolutely. And I think too, in the process of setting boundaries, the client is empowered by using their voice. And I envision, the Lion King, baby Simba has a little roar in the very beginning because he's tiny and he's less empowered. But as he grows older and becomes strong, his roar turns into a loud, glorious roar. And so practicing boundaries, becoming aware, everything that we've talked about will strengthen that survivor's voice or that family member's voice, and you will get bigger and grow in strength with that.
I love that. I love that image that you painted for us. Thank you so much. Kevin, you brought this up, but I wanted to ask, what exactly is that client bill of rights?
Yes, the Bill of Rights. It's like a 23-point little document that we give out to our participants. That was not a secret. We found it online last year and kind of adapted it to our group. But it's essentially like this list of places that you can set boundaries up, but it's more a list of like what you can do for yourself that you don't need to feel guilty of. So things like it's okay to say no. It's okay to not feel bad about saying no. It's okay to not have to give an explanation, which I think is huge because so many people are like white liars and they're like, I can't come to your party tonight. I had this thing that came up and it's really last minute. Just say I can't come tonight. I'm exhausted. It's fine. We all have been there. Like, how can no one's shocked at that? Like, I've had a long day. I can't come. I don't want to come. I would love to, but I don't want to. That's one of my favorite lines from Friends.
From Friends, right?
Yeah. Phoebe's like, oh, I'd love to, but I don't want to. Just be Phoebe.
I love to help. Don't want to. I love that though. You're absolutely right. They have every right to share that. You don't have to feel guilty about that feeling. I love that.
And especially now with COVID, like if you don't want to travel to that big 20-person family gathering, I don't want to. I don't feel comfortable with COVID right now. I will Skype. You can FaceTime me, but I just don't want to travel on a plane this year. Those things. SNL actually did a great sketch about it this past weekend or 2 weekends ago. It was like the three castmates and they were FaceTiming their moms and they were like, Mom, we can't come home. And then the moms overreact. They're like, oh, so you don't love me anymore. Oh, so you hate spending time with me. And it escalates. One of them like falls over and she's like, I've had a fall. You have to come home immediately. She's like, I saw you get on the ground.
The emotional toxicity I'm hearing from this.
It wraps around at the end and they're like, stay safe from SNL. But even I think one of the good things about the Bill of Rights too is that it says you have a right to do what you need to do and accept the consequences. And that's one that I always get questions about because it doesn't sound as empowering as the rest, but it's knowing I can say no. And if this person reacts negatively, I can accept that that's the consequence of the important boundary I have to set. Because the thing about all these is not everyone's going to be respectful of putting up that boundary or saying, no, I can't come or whatever it is. They might have a negative reaction. And that is not on the person saying no. That's, of course, on the person reacting. But it's like, no matter how they react, I can accept that consequence as a result of me doing what I need to for myself.
Always important to bring up, and it kind of reminds me of that flagging the minefield a little bit of just as long as you're kind of setting up your expectation and ready to say, ready for that reaction, as unfortunate as it is, I bet you that still brings some empowerment of, I understand, but, this is still my boundary. So I wanted to, just follow up question about, those expectations I was mentioning. So does the holiday season come with certain expectations that make setting boundaries even more difficult?
Absolutely. Kevin gave a great example, the SNL skit. Parents may not understand why their child may not want to come home, or if the child goes home and they've now come in with a set of boundaries, there could be some dynamics there for growth between all parties. And as people mature, they differentiate from who they are as an individual and they separate from that family dynamic. And sometimes family members may challenge that. The expectation might be to go back into that family and become whatever your role is in that family, you must revert back to that. And if that means that you are sacrificing your authentic self, sometimes that family dynamic doesn't care. And they just want you to be that older sibling or the younger sibling or, the caregiver, whatever it is, when you go in, you're rocking the boat. And that becomes difficult. And and the holiday season just exasperates that rock.
Yeah, absolutely. And, while you were talking about, I think definitely when you go back into the family unit, sometimes there could be some reverting back to how you fit into that family unit, or kind of a pull to do that. It makes me also think of those part of the LGBTQ plus community. Maybe if they went out and now they have changed their identity, or they've come, they're affirming their gender now, those kinds of things, and they come back into the family unit. I can assume that would be really stressful and hard to deal with as well. Kevin, was there anything you wanted to talk about as far as expectations?
I think just to second that, that constant reinforcement of boundaries is very real, especially when the boundaries are new and you have to remind people. But watching ourselves, because that role reversal is such a true phenomenon that when you go back home and the family's back together, you act again in the way that you always did, in a sense. Whether it's the leader of the family, the caretaker, the whatever that kind of role that you were put in kind of pops back up. And so to monitor that, like, oh, how am I behaving? And that's where that mindfulness comes in, like, oh, I'm self-aware, what's going on the inside, what's happening, what am I noticing about myself right now?
Awesome. So, we talked a little bit about being ready for someone's reaction to our boundary. And to further, that little toolkit to get people ready, I wanted to ask, what can someone do if their family members react negatively after setting a boundary?
I think it depends, if it's a family member or a boundary with a family member that you do love and cherish, just saying like, I love you this doesn't affect, I love you and our relationship and I love hanging out with you. It's just something that I'm doing for myself. Kind of putting that emphasis on the self, kind of like an I statement, like this is what's best for me. This just makes me have a better time when I'm with you. Kind of doing that reframe where it's to a positive rather than a negative type of boundary. If it's with a family member that you've always just had a hard time with, I would say just like a simple reflection, like I see that you're frustrated about this and I'm sorry that you're frustrated, but this is what I need to do. And just reinforcing, I recognize how it makes you feel. However, this is what is best for myself. We talk about fogging in the Surviving the Holidays, and it's this weird, it's in therapy books, it's a thing, but it doesn't sound like a therapeutic technique because it sounds like a way it can be aggravating. But an example is like, I told you, 10 times this week that you needed to cut the grass. The lawn is out of control. Something needs to be done about it. And simply just, yeah, the lawn is pretty long. It needs to be cut. Like just neutral energy, not accepting guilt or blame or saying that, okay, I'm going to go fix the problem right away. Like not giving in, just saying like, yes, I can see that. I can see that this boundary is upsetting to you. And just validating how they feel without changing what is happening.
I got it. It sounds like you're almost just acknowledging what you can see and then just moving on from it.
Yes.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because you want to avoid people getting defensive and being like, well, this is what's best for me, so you need to deal with it. This is my boundary. Especially too, because people get carried away with boundaries. They try to tell other people how to be. Like when you're around me, you can't. Like if two other people in the corner are having a conversation you don't want to be a part of, I might have a boundary where I'm not engaged in that, but I can't walk up and be like, you need to stop talking about that because I can hear you. It's my role then to probably just walk away. So you never want to tell other people how to be because we can only control ourselves and how people interact with us. So that can cause defensiveness when we tell other people how to be. So fogging can be a way of acknowledging how they feel while still maintaining that control over ourselves and our situation.
Such a good point to bring up, where boundaries really are about, our feelings and our, safety. But, if you're putting a boundary on someone else in that sense, that example you brought up, that would be a form of control. That's a little different, right, than talking about your own safety and what keeps you safe. Suzanne, anything you wanted to bring up about that?
Yeah. I'd say that fogging is the response to gaslighting, and with the emotional toxicity, it's a great strategy. Um, and I guess I would also add, it's important for people to stay calm when things are happening that feels uncomfortable. And that might be hard for trauma survivors, because it's not just a simple trigger. It could have a ripple effect of explosions and triggers, which is, could happen physically, psychologically, or there could be emotional threats. Um, and so I think staying calm and giving yourself permission to leave this space entirely if you need to. You are your first advocate. So empower yourself with follow through if someone is not respecting, your boundary.
That reminds me of something one of our clients even said. They just set a hard time limit. I will be there from noon to 5, but at 5 I have to leave, and just not. So I'm giving you 5 hours with me to do stuff, to do our family dinner, whatever. And with this client, it was for their pets. So it was I have to go home. I have to take care of the pets, and it was just. And I think this, their family knows now. They get that. But just setting that something as simple as a time limit, like, yes, I'll come for the day. No, I'm not going to spend the night. I don't mind driving an hour back home or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that there is kind of like this, it does depend on family units, of course, but sometimes there could be an expectation of like monopolizing someone's time for the holidays. Kind of like, well, you have to be with me all the time because you're home and blah, blah, So it makes sense that I love that idea of like, no, I'm gonna, I need just a time limit. That's a great example of one.
Oh yeah, I called my partner out last night, actually, because we have like a quarantine bubble with a couple friends that we see. So we went over to one of their houses for dinner, and my partner was like, we had texted. I knew that he wanted to go soon because he had to get up and work. So he stood up and was like, well, the dogs need to be let out. I was like, don't lie. Just say that you're tired and you want to go to bed. I was like, just say what you want. You just want to go to bed.
Yeah.
I love that.
Everyone laughed.
It makes me
that's
think.
Fine.
It makes me think about my grandpa when I was younger, and he would always be like, "Oh, we gotta go feed the horses and go let the dogs out." And I'm looking back like, "Oh, Grandpa just wanted to get out."
Yeah, just wanted to go.
Yeah, just say it.
Yeah. So going off of, kind of what you were saying earlier, Suzanne, about, how to react if someone does cross a boundary. What else can someone do as far as strategies if their boundaries are crossed?
I think removing yourself from the situation, and that, I'm a firm believer that actions speak louder than words. And so if people keep crossing those boundaries, and then I also think it's important that once you do remove yourself, that you use grounding techniques to finish the activated response to help you bring yourself back into that optimal zone. I think it's a good way to figure out how you can take care of yourself, whether it's guided meditation, talking with a friend or a therapist, someone you trust. Kevin said journaling, just finding a source of creativity that will help you finish that response and calm yourself and put yourself back in a place where you feel calm and healthy again.
That constant reinforcement, knowing that, and I know our next little bullet point is the emotional safety plan, which I think comes into play here. Like, I think the emotional safety plan can be the flagging the minefield, the journaling, the scaling, kind of that self-awareness of knowing my 1 to 10 reactions, like scale of 1 out of 10. I think just broken record it'll be tedious. Like, I told you once, I shouldn't have to tell you again. Like, unfortunately, not everyone remembers. And people will try to see what they can get away with your boundaries the first couple times you put them into place. So just that broken record, like, oh, no, thank you. I don't like a surprise hug. I'd like to be asked first. It can be easy to get defensive when reinforcing the boundaries. Like, I already told you I'm not comfortable with this. And then we're escalated. They're going to get defensive because it feels like a personal attack that we don't want their physical touch, or we don't want to engage in a conversation with them. So I think as best as we can, like, remain calm, be like, hey, totally okay. I know I only told you once. Just so you know, again, I'm not cool with hugging, or I'm not cool with, or I don't, please stop asking me to have a drink. It could be anything. Like, I don't want a drink, I have to drive home. Any of those things, just that, hey, you may have forgotten. I think it can get to a point where it's like, okay, this is like the 5th time I've reminded you. It seems now like you're not respecting my boundaries. And then you can call it. I think 3rd time's the charm. The rule of 3. By the 3rd time the boundaries crossed, then it's okay to call it out and be like, hey, I have said this multiple times tonight. I'm wondering what about this boundary is what's not clicking.
I love that. I think that's such a good point, where a lot of times when we talk about certain skills and things, we think it's like, okay, you do it and then move on, but it does seem like, life is life and people are people. And like, it's important to talk about like the follow-up, what happens after too. And I think that that's totally fair to have to just, remind someone. Of course, it does sound like it would depend on what the boundary is. If it's very, clear cut and it really does violate your safety, obviously, like, that reaction of someone's boundary being crossed could just be removing yourself completely from the situation. I guess it's about, how you're feeling. But like, I love that example of like the drink, for example, following up and say, I know I just told you for the first time, and then just kind of having that conversation. I love that.
Yeah, I love that example. And I think too, it's important to build a support team ahead of time, because things might come up and you might just be blindsided and look around like, what is my reaction? Or so if you build a support team ahead of time, you can process so that you can prepare yourself for the next time, if there's a next time. And then if you have a support team, call them, use them. Don't sit in isolation and try to process things on your own. There is a part for reflection and meditation, but there is a part to get it out verbally, or just with someone. And I think it's also important to remember it takes time to set and maintain boundaries. And sometimes it's particularly difficult just to become aware of the boundaries we may need. And if you need extra help figuring all that out, groups like CODA, Al-Anon, even a VSC support group will give you that extra support and connectiveness you might need, and get tools and strategies from people who are in similar situations. There's a lot of healing power in group connectedness.
I love that. I always like to remind everyone, absolutely, you're not alone. I think that this podcast will resonate with a lot of people, especially during this time with the holidays and everything. That being said, I think that's a great place to sign off. But before I do, is there anything else you, Kevin, or you, Suzanne, would like to say to survivors of trauma or their supporters that are listening?
Yeah, I think the last that I have is not just going into the holidays, but going ongoing, is to, and this sounds weird, we all have like that voice in our head, not necessarily in terms of psychosis, some people do, and that's fine, but we all have like a voice in our head that's kind of like that little observer that's seeing what's going on, and it usually is pretty negative. It's like, oh, that was stupid, why'd you do that? Like, ugh, we're running late again, I can't believe it, we're gonna get in trouble, whatever. I'm never late, I'm actually always usually early, for the record. But change that voice into like your cheerleader. Change that to, someone who, even when you're in a room of all only stressful and toxic people, you can be promoting yourself. You can change that criticism to compassion. And it can be that third party observer in your head that practices noticing, oh, I see that sadness is happening. Something's making us sad. What's going on? It's like little, command center HQ in your head. And there's that many you inside, and it's noticing what's going on in our body at all times. It kind of has its constantly scanning. Once we can get to that, and that, mind you, that doesn't happen overnight, but getting to that level of like self-awareness where we can be like, okay, yep, I'm noticing that I'm already a little frustrated today. Why? What's going on? What do we need to do about it? Can be so immensely helpful when it's mixed with that positive cheerleader self, like keeping us going, not beating ourselves up, giving ourselves the compassion that we need. So that's an ongoing thing that I do with a lot of my clients. But to start giving that some thought, because that can be so helpful and make every stressful situation much less stressful when we know we can look out for ourselves.
I love that. I love that idea of, just being kinder to ourselves and understanding for ourselves, just like we would be with other people too. I think, just as you were saying earlier, Suzanne, we are our first advocates, and kind of building that little advocate within us is so important. Anything you'd like to say, Suzanne, before we sign off?
Yeah, I think trauma survivors spend a lot of their time locked up from feeling anything, because in their experience, the things they felt have or may have been extremely painful. I hope they believe and they know that our brains are wired to heal, and as you heal, your war will grow louder and more powerful. And in the meantime, I'm sending you love and peace in a healing space.
I think that's a beautiful place to sign off. So thank you so much. And thank you for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you're not alone. And thank you so much, Kevin and Suzanne, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.